Excellent. So yes, those area profiles that Stephen mentioned, in addition to lots of demographic data and other information about the populations in those catchment areas, they do also give you audience spectrum segmentation as well, which is one of the things we're looking at today. So hopefully this session will help you understand the data that's in those area profiles as well. So it all links together in a very beautiful way. So without further ado, so this is what we're looking at today. We'll have some brief introductions, then we'll be looking at what segmentation is, how it can be useful to you. We'll be looking at audience spectrum, which is our own segmentation model in a bit more detail. And then there's at the end some information about the next session and also links to further sources and resources that you might find useful. As Stephen said, we're aiming to finish at 3:30, but if anyone needs to step out for any reason, that's absolutely fine. We've got a short break scheduled for around 2:45. But it will be quite short, it'll just be about 5 minutes. But again, please feel free to step away at any point if you need to. And also do ask questions or make comments as we go through, if you feel comfortable doing that. If you'd rather not say it live because of being recorded or for any other reason, feel free to drop a note in the comments, and we'll pick those up as well. In terms of, I think I've missed a slide about us. Oh no, I haven't. Well, just a quick introduction to the Audience Agency for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We're a national and international audience development organisation, and we exist primarily to support arts and cultural organisations build deeper and more meaningful relationships with their audiences in lots of different ways, specifically based on using audience data and consultation. So to really build an in-depth understanding of who your audiences are and who they might be and how you can develop them. My role at the agency, I'm part of the consultancy team, and I largely work with organisations like museums and heritage sites that have a visitor offer. Other colleagues have specialisms with performing arts and things like that. So we cover all different art forms, lots of different organisations with different sizes and levels and types of governance. And this is part of the sort of work that we do. So these training sessions are, you know, sort of part and parcel of all of that activity. So that's me and the Audience Agency. I know some of you are returning from the first session, but at this point it would be really nice just to see who's in the room today. So if we can just quickly go round everybody, and very briefly, if you could share your name and your role at your museum, and then just something you enjoy doing in all of that spare time that I know that you have. Yeah, something that you enjoy in your leisure time. I will pick on somebody to start, and then if that person, when they've introduced themselves, can nominate the next volunteer, that would be great. So I am going to ask Jason to get us started because your name is in the centre of my screen. If Jason is there. No, perhaps he's wandered off, in which case I'm going to pick on Laura because I can see that you're with us.
Hello, yeah, my name is Laura. I'm the Communications and Events Officer at the Novium Museum in Chichester. Something that I enjoy doing in my spare time. I started running in lockdown, in first lockdown, and have grown to really enjoy it.
Fantastic, thank you. Do you want to pick on somebody else, and hopefully they'll be there?
Okay, Charlotte, she's next on the list.
Hello, I'm Charlotte Griffiths, and I am the marketing officer at Discover Bucks Museum. And I was literally going to say running too. I haven't been as good recently because I've managed to break my little toe, but hopefully it's mending, so I'll be back running soon, hopefully. I'm going to pick on Kelly.
Yeah. Hi. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me.
We can.
Yeah, brilliant. Oh, sorry, my video doesn't seem to be working. So my name's Kelly. I'm the Heritage Collections and Digital Engagement Officer at Heritage Eastbourne, and I am a self-confessed book addict. And that's what I enjoy doing.
Fantastic, thank you.
That's okay. And then just to pick on someone, let's go for Hannah.
Hi, I'm the Marketing and Events Officer at the Army Flying Museum, and I work with Joe, who's a Marketing and Events Manager. I don't think his mic works, so I just thought I'd fill you in on that. I really enjoy all sorts of things, reading books, but dog walking, I guess. So, yeah, I will pick on, is it Lana?
Lana's, yes. Thank you, Lana. I can see your note. Hula hooping sounds great fun. I think I like that. So shall we hear from Kezia?
Hi, I'm Keziah. I'm Communications and Marketing Assistant at Talna. I don't really have any spare time. I'm doing an MA and I work 2 jobs, so I guess I just sleep.
That sounds like a very good use of any spare time that you might have to me. So we haven't heard from Joe, but Joe doesn't have a mic. I don't know if you want to make a note in the comments, Joe. Not to worry if not. But thank you for all of those. Is anybody here who hasn't spoken? I think I've noted that we've heard from everybody. Exciting range of different things that people like to do, which is fantastic. Okay, so moving on to thinking about segmentation. What is it? So essentially, the process of segmentation is about splitting customers or potential customers, audiences within a particular market group into different groups or segments where they share things in common within that particular context. So it's either around sort of similar level of interest in something, or shared needs or shared preferences, something that can be where if you targeted something at that group, you know what it is that would appeal to everybody in that group. And that I've put up on the screen here a sort of more formal definition of what segmentation is from a marketing perspective. But essentially, it's a relatively straightforward way of grouping people by things that they have in common. And I think it's worth pointing out at this stage that you know, segmentation can take lots of different forms. They can be very simple. So it could be, you know, people who like football, people who don't like football, or they could be more complex. So it could be people who follow particular football teams. It could be, you know, breaking down those groups even further, so younger people who follow a certain football team. So segments can be as large or as small as you want them to be, depending on what's going to be most useful for you to know about them in order to target them as a group. But essentially each segment, each group will have shared primary characteristics that they have in common, and also probably some underlying things that they share as well. So how it can help you is essentially it really sits at the heart of understanding who your audiences are, and making meaningful connections with them based on their needs and preferences in a really targeted way that helps you to change what you do and who you do it for within your organisation in a sustainable way that's understood across the organisation, using a sort of shared language when you're talking about the types of people that you want to engage with, the sorts of audiences that you want to reach. So it's a really helpful tool for starting to break down all of those individuals that you see coming through the door and the people that you know are in perhaps your local population that you're not seeing, and really starting to think about how you can attract them and work with them. There's lots of different ways of segmenting groups, as I say, and some of the key areas where segmentations often focus are geodemographic, so where people are and who they are. Some segmentations are behavioural, so they're based on the things that people like to do and the things that they do more frequently or less frequently. Some are attitudinal, so based on how people feel about a particular activity and the role that it plays in their life and how they identify. And some can be a mixture of one or two or any of those different factors. And you can also define the segments in different ways as well. So you can cluster people by the things that they have in common, or you can sort of define them in a particular way. So in the model here, you can see that you can take all of your audiences and you can immediately divide those into the people who visit you and the people who don't visit you. So your current and your potential audiences, and then you can break those down again. So within your visitors, you might have people who just come and see your exhibitions, you might have people who just come along to events, and you might have people who do both. And in your non-visitors, you might have local people who don't visit you, and you might have non-local people who don't visit you. So there's lots of different ways of dividing people. And in thinking about how to use a segmentation, the important thing is to identify what is going to be useful for you. And you can have ready-made segmentations, or some organisations who have perhaps a very specialised offer might decide that for them to be really targeted about what they do, they need a bespoke segmentation which is tailored very much to their needs. So in terms of some examples of those types of segmentation, some ready-made ones that you might be familiar with are Mosaic, which is quite widely used by commercial organisations and also by local authorities, because it has a lot of socio-demographic information in the segmentation, and its purpose is very much around consumer habits. So what sort of jobs people have, where they live, the cars they drive, what sort of media they consume, and things like that. So it's used a lot for commercial organisations to identify who their customers are likely to be, and how they can reach out to them. You also may have come across Maurice Hargreaves McIntyre culture segments. This is a segmentation model which is quite widely used, particularly in the museum and heritage sector. And it's based on attitudes to engagement with museums and heritage, essentially. So what actually motivates people to engage with that particular offer. But it's very much, unlike Mosaic, it's not a whole population segmentation, because there are some people who won't fit into any of those segments because they don't have those particular attitudes towards engagement in that context. But it's, it's very focused, very targeted segmentation, and it is quite widely used. And then the segmentation that the audience agency built on commission from the Arts Council is called Audience Spectrum, and it replaces an earlier model which you may or may not have been familiar with, called Arts Audiences Insights, which was a bit clunky, even for a segmentation model, and did make some assumptions about people that meant that it wasn't terribly useful. So Audience Spectrum was built to update that idea, very much focused on the arts and cultural sector and the role that arts and culture play in people's lives, the relationship they have with it, the opportunities that they have to engage, and the barriers that they might face. And we will look at it in a little bit more detail later on. But essentially, it's a hybrid model. So it does have some geodemographic information within it. It is a full population segmentation. So every household in the UK falls into one of the 10 segments. But it also has a lot of attitudinal and behavioural information in it as well, because of the data sets that we use to inform it, which we will look at in a bit. Has anybody used any of those segmentation models in the past?
No, we haven't.
No. Anybody heard of them but not used them? Or is this all entirely new?
New to me.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. Cool. Well, hopefully, even if you have come across them or used them, there will still be some useful information in this session for you. And thinking about the, ooh, I've skipped ahead again. Thinking about the bespoke segments that I was talking about, there are places like the National Archives, for example. They have a bespoke segmentation because, along with their public audiences who might come along to exhibitions and events in the way that they would do for other organisations, they also have a very specialist research audience that they wanted to understand in more detail. So they have a bespoke segmentation which brings in that whole range of different types of audience and who might be engaging with them. So when you're looking at using segmentation, there are various different ways that it can help you, particularly in your strategic planning, because it supports both internal growth as an organisation, but also external growth and change in terms of the people that you engage with. So internally, it can help build a shared understanding of who your target audiences are and why they're important to you strategically, and also a shared language to talk about them and embed them in your day-to-day activities across different teams and different areas of delivery, including marketing and programming, learning and participation, even sort of your secondary spend development offer. So, you know, the things that you have for sale in the shop and things like that. So it can support all of the activities that go on in your organization. And it can also help you with understanding who you might partner with. So, you know, it helps you to share an understanding with other organizations of who target audiences might be and where you share the same sorts of targets and values to help you build effective partnerships as well. And externally, segmentation can help you to understand the different needs and expectations of different types of audience. Because, I mean, one of the things that we touched on in the last session is that one size does not fit all. So in order to meet the needs of different audiences, you need to think about the different things you might do for them. And segmentation can really help you with that. And I think one of the hardest things often for organizations to deal with and articulate is the idea that if you're trying to make everything that you offer for everybody, what it actually means is that nothing you do is quite meeting the needs of any particular audience. But I think for some organisations it can feel that if you're targeting one particular audience that you are in some way excluding other audiences. And I think that can be quite hard to sort of deal with sometimes, because nobody wants to be exclusionary in any way. But as we looked at in the last session, and if you weren't able to attend, you can watch the recording of that. The idea of a strategic audience development plan is that you have lots of different layers in it. So you will be doing different types of activity to engage with different types of audience. So everyone is being reached to some extent through your plan, but each activity individually doesn't have to meet the needs of everybody. So you can be much more targeted about the way you present things and the types of programming you do to meet the needs of different audiences. So really understanding who you want to engage with particular types of activity means that you can create more meaningful and engaging opportunities for people to engage with you. So using segmentation means that you can develop different elements in your offer and tailor them to meet the needs of those different target groups. So across your offer as a whole, you're meeting their needs in different ways. So for example, a family who might be looking for a fun, social type of activity would need to know that that's what you're offering. And, through, is it free? Is it drop-in? Is it multi-generational? What is it that they're going to enjoy when they come? So thinking about what you tell them about it and the channels that you use to communicate that goes a long way to encouraging particular types of audience to attend. Whereas a family who are perhaps looking for shared learning opportunities, and those two things aren't necessarily exclusive, it's just that people may be motivated more by one than the other. But they will need to know about what sort of learning objectives you're hoping to achieve through delivery of a particular activity, how long they might need to commit to it, what sort of ages it's aimed at, and that sort of information. So there's, slightly different ways of programming and messaging to meet the needs of those two different groups who might be seen as, family attenders, but actually have quite different needs and motivations. And all of this applies to both your in-person visitors, but also your online digital visitors as well. So the audiences that you attract through online activities. And increasingly post-COVID, we've seen that organisations have developed and are continuing to develop perhaps more nuanced and more developed offers online than perhaps they had pre-COVID, firstly as a response to need, but then seeing that that has engaged audiences that perhaps you weren't reaching previously. But thinking about how you develop different types of content for different types of audience is as important for your digital engagement as it is for your on-site engagement, and segmentation can help you with all of that as well. So thinking more about why you might want to segment your audiences and how it can help you. So as I've just been talking about, people have different needs and they will be attending for different reasons. There may be different barriers that they face to engagement, and they need different sorts of information. So because you can't communicate individually with each person and meet their needs on an individual basis, segmentation is the next best thing, because it groups people by what they have in common in terms of those needs and motivations. And in terms of what you offer, the things that you can vary are, what you do. So the programs that you put on, the types of exhibitions that you might present, for example, different events and activities. How you do it and where you do it. So do you deliver everything on site? Is some some of it done digitally. Are there opportunities to take what you do out to other locations where you might find people who aren't coming into the museum? Who you do it with, so in partnership with other people, or having guest curators, or co-curated activity with some of your target groups. And also how and where you talk about it. So what sort of messaging you use, what sort of images appear in your marketing information, what sort of channels you're using to communicate with people. And all of those things can be targeted at particular audience groups, depending on who your priorities are for engaging with different types of audience. And I think, as we looked at in the first session, it's always important to think about this as a cross-organisation activity. So although segmentation is quite heavily used by marketing professionals, for example, your segmentation within your audience development planning is not only the role of the marketing team or the person who does your marketing for you. It is something that can be applied to all activities across the museum. And what does that get you? So you can get more audiences, more of the same sorts of people and different audiences. You might be able to encourage them to visit more often, depending on what they're looking for from a repeat offer, for example. You can build really meaningful relationships with them because you're thinking about what it is that they need from you, what's going to make for the best sort of experience for them, and how you're going to meet their needs and their expectations, and the sorts of things that they like to do. And potentially you can also build your financial resilience as well, because there will be certain audience groups who might be more or less willing and able to pay for particular types of offer, or to take advantage of any of your shop or your cafe offer if you have those on site as well. So really, it's almost impossible to not segment your audiences, whether you do that informally or in a more formal way using one of those segmentation models that I talked about earlier. So you're probably already doing it to some extent. So quite often organisations will think about, oh, we want to target young people, or we want to target families, or we want to target older people in the community, or particular community groups. And that in itself is a way of segmenting to understand who those audiences are and how you might engage with them. So taking it to the sort of next level, and sort of demonstrating the power of segmentation, really. So when you're thinking about family audiences, families come in all shapes and sizes, as you will be aware, and they will have, within those different types of family group, they will have different needs and different reasons for potentially visiting with you. So, just two very broad basic examples that you will probably be familiar with. You might have people who are regular visitors to your museum and other museum and heritage sites. Perhaps I've got age 6, I meant age 60 plus there. So slightly older visitors perhaps, who might be visiting with their grandchildren, for example. And they're looking for a way to share their interests with those grandchildren through museum and heritage visiting. And what they're looking for from their visit and their engagement will be very different from a family group who perhaps visit museums occasionally as part of a day out. Maybe they have slightly younger children, and they're looking for something which would be sort of guaranteed entertainment for the family, perhaps as part of a celebration or a wider day out, which might involve doing lots of other activities as well as a museum visit. So even with those two groups, you're already seeing quite distinct differences between people who in other ways have lots in common. So families as a whole, their sort of basic hygiene needs in terms of, a family-friendly welcome and facilities to support visiting with children will be the same, regardless of their particular motivations or, whether they're more or less highly engaged. But when you start breaking them down, then you can see that there are distinct needs for groups within the sort of family groupings. And with that in mind, this is our first opportunity to go into breakout groups, which I believe Stephen has set up. Excellent. Have we got 2 groups, Stephen? Or have we got... how many groups are we splitting?
We've got 2 groups, sorry.
2 groups.
Kezia has had to leave because she's been called away. So one of them's got the 2 groups of 3 effectively, I'm afraid. So Joe, you're on one group. Hopefully you can communicate through chats. Obviously it's going to be a little bit slow. It depends how fast you are at typing.
Excellent. Oh, not time for a break quite yet. So in your different groups, in your 2 groups that you'll go into in a second, what I'd like you to do is thinking back to the things that you talked about right at the beginning of this session about what it is that you like to do in your spare time. What I'd like to do is think about what it is that you might have in common with other people who also like to do that thing. So other people who like to hula hoop, or other people who like running or reading. What is it that you might have in common with those people? And how could you use that understanding of what it is that appeals to people about a particular activity to encourage other people to take part? So if you wanted to encourage other people to take up running as a hobby, what might you say about it to encourage them? And thinking about all of that all together, the final question is, how do you think you might use that sort of approach of thinking about what it is that's appealing about an activity to a particular group of people, and how you would talk to them about it? How would that help you in developing your audience development strategies? How could you put it into practice in your museum? And what I'd like you to do is, during your discussions, nominate somebody from your group who will feed back on, particularly on that 3rd question, in terms of thinking about how you might use that approach to inform your audience development. I will put the questions in the chat so that you'll have them to see once you're in your groups, and you'll have, how long have I allowed for this? So we'll have about 5 minutes for the discussion part of this, so quite a quick fire chat, and as you're quite small groups, that should be okay, and then about 10 minutes when we come back, before we go into a break, to share what you've come up with in your discussion groups. So Stephen, do you want to send people into...
Okay, I'm just doing that. Seema has just joined us. I don't know if I can put her into a group, but I don't know if you want to brief her.
Oh, yes, I will do very quickly. Hi, Seema.
Oh, hi there.
Hi.
Thanks. Sorry I'm late.
Don't worry. We're just sending people into groups, so I thought it might be worth having a very quick chat with you before you get put into a group, so you're not
yeah,
sort of
sure.
a bit bewildered about. Excellent. Nice to see you all back. So could we have the spokesperson from, did you number them, Stephen? Were they group 1 and group 2? Or were they, oh, you're muted, sorry. Sorry, Stephen, you're on mute.
Sorry, I had my face blocked by the breakout group thing. So room 1 was Hannah, Kelly and Laura, and the rest were in group 2.
Lovely. So could someone from group 1 feedback on how you think you might use that idea of understanding what people have in common in order to encourage them to engage with your museum?
Yeah, so I'm the spokesperson.
Thank you, Laura.
We concentrated on running as an example and thought about what sort of attracts people, what attracts people to get past and to take part. And we sort of focused on park run as an example, because it's very accessible. So making it really accessible to, literally anyone can come along and take part. They don't have to run, they can walk, but they can see people of all different ages and abilities, having fun and coming together as a community. So there is that sort of community angle there as well. It's a really, really accessible, free way of, I think some people literally just come along for the community aspect. They volunteer, not necessarily run, but it really gets people involved. And so I suppose, so someone sort of looking from outside would see that as quite, it was a really enjoyable community event that's very, very easy to be part of.
Nice. I like that idea about thinking about different routes in to engaging with something. So to begin with, you might not necessarily need to run, but you can still be a part of it. I think that's a really nice idea.
Yeah. I think it's very easy to be put off by thinking, oh no, I can't do something. I know personally that's put me off a huge number of things over the years. But yeah, if you look at it and think, oh, actually, I don't have to do that, but I could do that and still be involved. Different routes in.
Great, thank you very much. And what about group 2? What thoughts did you have?
It was a little tricky to start with because Joe and Lana don't have any audio, but then Simon joined, so it got a bit easier. But basically, we all prefer to do different things in our spare time. We didn't have any sort of thing that sort of like joined us together. But the main thing from those groups, so Lana does hula hooping and Joe does taekwondo, but it's all about sort of consistency. And building relationships and community, and that is the sole driver for these things. Really, it's to be part of a group, and we very much acknowledged, Simon and I, we're from the same museum, that we're not very good at consistency. So it's actually creating a regular program of activities that appeals to certain groups. And they know what time it's going to be on, when it's going to be, and they know in advance, have enough time to plan, and they can see the same people each time and create a community that way. That's definitely something that we need to do.
Yeah, it's a really good idea, and particularly for family engagement, those kind of regular things that people know, if they come on every third Saturday in the month, they know there's something going to be going on and they know it's going to be enjoyable, building up those relationships. No, it's a really good approach. Fantastic, thank you so much. So we're going to have a very quick break now before we start looking at one of the segmentation models, the audience spectrum model, in a bit more detail. So if we aim to be back by 3 o'clock, that would be great. Thank you very much. So for the last part of today's session, we will look in a bit more detail at audience spectrum. And I think, the conversations that you were having before can be a really helpful way of thinking about segmentation, because I think it's very important to bear in mind that any segmentation tool is a relatively blunt instrument. It groups people by the things they have in common, but obviously, each person is an individual, but it doesn't ignore that fact. Equally, it's not about stereotyping, it is about understanding the things that we have in common in particular contexts. And although we are all individuals, there are things that we share with other people in different situations. And that's really the best way to think about segmentation, is to, it's a way of grouping people by the things they have in common, whilst not denying that we are all individuals. But as I say, you can't program or communicate with each individual person that you would like to engage with your museum. So segmentation is, the next best thing in terms of understanding who those people are and what it is they're most likely to respond to, what's going to be meaningful for them. And that's essentially what Audience Spectrum aims to do. And this is a segmentation that was built very specifically to support organisations in the arts and cultural sector. So that's the context in which we're looking at the things that people have in common. As I say, it is a full UK population segmentation. So every household in the country belongs to one of the 10 segments within the Audience Spectrum profiles. So as I say, it's a bit of a hybrid in terms of the modelling that went into it. So although it has geolocatable information in it, so we know where people live, which makes it much easier to identify how to engage with them. You know whether they're in your local population or not. But it also includes things that people have in common in terms of how they feel about arts and culture, how frequently they engage, their attitudes towards it, their preferences, and the barriers that they might face. And two of the really important things for me about Audience Spectrum are that it acknowledges that everybody engages with arts and culture to some extent or another. Some people do that more because they have more opportunity, or it's more a part of who they are, how they identify, so it's more important to them. And some people engage to a lesser extent, perhaps because there aren't the opportunities there for them, or they face more significant barriers to being able to do that. It's very rarely the case that people fall into the lower engaged groups because of a lack of interest. It's much more likely to be lack of confidence or lack of opportunity to engage. And also, the lower engaged groups, although they're not engaging with arts and culture in a formal sense, so perhaps they're not visiting particular venues, they're not, attending theatres or going to museums and things, they're still doing quite a lot in their local areas or in their community groups or at home. So they are still engaging to an extent, and the segmentation can help you understand how to tap into those interests that they have and give them the confidence to visit you, what sort of information they need and where they're most likely to pick up on any information that you put out. But the other important thing about Audience Spectrum is that it makes no value judgments about the types of arts and culture that people might enjoy, or their reasons for engaging with one thing or another more than perhaps other art forms. So it is, it does recognise all different types and levels of engagement with arts and culture, and all of the motivations and preferences that sit within those different activities. So just have a quick look at the segments themselves. There are 3 highly engaged groups. So these are people who engage both regularly and frequently across different types of art form. There are 3 medium engaged groups, so people who are engaging less frequently, but still, as part of their sort of regular days out and things like that. And then there are 4 lower engaged groups, all of whom face slightly different barriers to engagement, which prevent them from doing things more frequently. And the segmentation was built on some very large data sets. So again, this is not about stereotyping or making assumptions about what people do and what they like to do. It's based on evidence of their engagement with arts and culture. So it brings in the National Taking Part Survey, which gives a lot of information about how people feel about arts and culture, and what sorts of things that they're doing. It takes in an understanding of what sort of offer is available in different areas of the country. It brings in Experian data, which is what sits behind the mosaic profiling, so that we do have some socioeconomic demographic information that sits beneath the segments. And I think it's really important to point out that although that data is in there and it is very useful, audience spectrum itself is not a demographic segmentation. So, you know, what we see of people's behaviour is that their interests and their motivations for engagement are not necessarily driven by their demographic or socioeconomic profiles, although they do have things in common across those different data sets. It also has census data in there, and it's also something that we are continuously testing through our audience finder platform to see if people are actually behaving in the way that we would expect them to based on the segment that they belong to. So we're sort of updating it and making sure that, you know, people are behaving in the way that we thought they would. And that's been particularly important post-COVID because we have seen changes in behaviour as a result of the pandemic and the different impacts that it's had on people. So in terms of what those groups look like, so these are the three higher engaged groups: metroculturals, commuter land culture buffs, and experience seekers. And at this stage, I should say that, you know, all segmentations have this sort of shorthand naming systems within them. Don't worry too much about the names themselves. They're used to identify the sort of key characteristics that differentiate one group from another. But the most important thing is to understand who these people are. And there's lots of information on our website and through the Audience Finder platform in the pen portraits for each of these segments. We will look at them in a little bit more detail in a minute. But you can get a lot of information from the pen portraits about where people are, what their preferences are, what the routes to engagement are with a particular group. So yes, the names are just sort of trying to capture what it is about this group that sets it apart from the others. But for these three groups, the differences, you know, the reasons why they are more highly engaged, they're all very confident. They are keen consumers of arts and culture across a wide range of art forms. They're very well informed about the things that they like to do. But within the groups, you know, those tastes do vary and their motivations vary as well. Each of these three groups is overrepresented in audience profiles compared to the population across all art forms. So they account for around 22% of the population overall, but 60% of audiences. So, you know, and that, as I say, it's across all art forms that they are overrepresented compared to the population. Metroculturals are very important in London, particularly. 85% of all the metroculturals in the country live in London, and a lot of them work in the arts and cultural sector. They are always out and about and doing lots of different things. Whereas if we look at experience seekers, they're the youngest group. And they're really looking for a social experience. So they do a lot, but it's part of an active social life rather than the arts and culture being at the centre of what they're looking for in the way that it is for metroculturals and commuter land culture buffs. So there are differences in what they're looking for, even within the groups that have a lot in common in terms of how they engage. The three medium engaged groups still overrepresented in audience profiles compared in the population compared to audience profiles, but to a lesser extent. So They do account for a large proportion of the UK population, but they also account for, just less than a third of all audiences. They tend to be more drawn to more mainstream offers, things that they're familiar with. They're not quite as experimental as the more highly engaged groups. And they don't tend to have the same range of offer available to them in their local areas. So their opportunities to engage are slightly less. Otherwise, some of them might actually be doing more if there was more opportunity. And then the 4 lower engaged groups are underrepresented across all art forms compared to how they appear in the population. And as I say, they do engage with different types of arts and culture, but not very frequently, and in very low proportions compared to the rest of the population. And the reasons for that vary across the different segments, but some things they have in common are lack of opportunity, and confidence is a big thing for the lower engaged groups. So, for example, they need a lot of information about what sort of experience to expect, because it's not part of their sort of everyday experience. It's not something that they're familiar with. So they really need to understand what to expect from a visit, but equally they need to understand what might be expected of them. Because, particularly for lower engaged family groups, they need to know that if they come and their children are sort of noisy and running about, that they won't be made to feel embarrassed. They need to know that they won't be expected to have a certain level of knowledge in order to, have a good experience from a visit, for example. So they need quite a lot of reassurance because they're less confident than those higher engaged groups. And also some of them face significant financial barriers to getting out and about. And the least engaged group, Heydays, which are also the oldest segment, they face very significant physical barriers. A lot of them are living in care homes or in assisted living. But at earlier stages in their life, they may well have fallen into one of the other engagement levels. So again, it's important to understand that lack of interest is not necessarily the greatest barrier for these people to engage. There are other things that they face that you can think about how to overcome through your programming and messaging and marketing, and perhaps some outreach as well for some of these groups. And I mentioned that you can get a lot of information from the pen portraits that are available online. And this is just a snapshot really of what that information looks like. So there are many layers of information about each of the segments. And that includes their interests, including what they like to do in their leisure time outside of arts and culture. So, for some groups, they have a greater interest in gardening and DIY and things like that, for example, so that you can start to think about how your programming might tap into wider interests within the target groups that you want to engage with. It includes information about their preferences for the sorts of art forms they like to engage with. Are they more drawn to museums and heritage? Are they more drawn to performing arts and so on? Where they are geographically, so you can see whether they are a likely audience for you or not, depending on whether they might be in your local communities, or as we hopefully emerge from COVID and the domestic tourist trade picks up again, whether they might be, potential for visitors to where you are. And there's also, for each of the segments, there's a statistical download, and you can see some details from that on the left-hand side of the slide. And this gives you a lot of detail about how each segment indexes against other segments. So to what extent they are more or less likely, for example, to become donors for museums and heritage groups, or for different art forms, to what extent they're more or less likely to visit more frequently, or what sort of art forms they like to engage with. So that's a huge amount of detail about each of these segments. And I think part of your audience development strategy is really starting to understand who your target audiences might be, and how you want to engage with them, because it also gives you a really good steer on which elements of your offer are likely to be most attractive and meaningful for different segment groups. Within the Southeast, these are the groups who are most significant in the population profiles. So community land culture buffs have traditionally been a very important audience for museum and heritage visiting. They're one of the more highly engaged groups, and they're also one of the groups that's been most affected by COVID, which we'll look at in a minute. Experience seekers also appear in Southeast regional populations, but in the more urban areas, in the larger towns and cities in the region. Dormitory dependables are another group who appear quite highly in populations across the Southeast, along with trips and treats and home and heritage. So all three of those segments are quite highly represented across the Southeast regions. And for museum visits in particular, trips and treats and home and heritage are two of the core audiences for museum visiting. And then the two lower engaged groups who do appear in some Southeast population profiles are Facebook families, who are in some of the larger towns and the fringes of the larger cities. They're a more urban and suburban group. And also Up Our Street, who are prevalent in smaller towns in the region. So those are likely to be the sorts of people that you're looking at, particularly in the short term, if they are in your local population areas. And that's the information that you can get from those area profiles that Stephen was talking about at the beginning of the session. So those can be a really valuable tool for you in understanding who's in your local area, particularly post-COVID, as people aren't traveling as far as they used to and they are looking for more local opportunities. That can be a really good place to start thinking about who you might include in your target groups. And also, as I've said, importantly, thinking about how those audiences might have changed post-COVID. So you've probably already noticed a difference in the people who are coming in through your door, particularly if pre-COVID, a higher proportion of your audiences were people visiting from further away. So those organisations who have in the past relied on more of a UK domestic tourism trade, for example, have seen quite a dramatic change in the people who are coming through the door. So we'll have a look in a bit more detail in the last few minutes at each of those segments, which are particularly important for the Southeast. Community land culture buffs, I think, are a really interesting segment in that they are the segment who are most likely to say that arts and culture is an important part of who they are. And they're also one of the segments that's been most severely impacted by COVID because of the age group. Most of them are age 70 plus, and a high proportion of them have been shielding throughout COVID. So they've really been missing on the arts and cultural engagement that's such an important part of their life. They have been looking for opportunities to return to outdoor visiting. So the reopening of heritage gardens early on after lockdown was a big boon for this group. They were able to start getting out and about again. But they are one of the segments which is still showing low levels of readiness to return to in-person, indoor engagement. So if in your audiences this was a group who made up a high proportion of your visitors, and they have been very significant for museum visitor profiles, it's unlikely that you're going to see them returning anytime soon unless you have them in your local catchment area, because that's where they're going to start returning earlier, is places where they don't have to travel so far. And also they are very keen supporters of museums and heritage organisations. So that's another way that you might be able to keep them engaged if they are an existing audience for you. They are keen to continue supporting organisations through individual giving or through membership, even whilst they're not actually able to visit in person. So they're quite a significant group and worth getting to know them. Experience seekers, again, for those of you who live near larger urban areas, larger towns and cities, this is an important group. They're not venue loyal though. They're the sort of museum Friday late crowd. So they're looking for something different to do. They don't see themselves as being at high risk from COVID in terms of health, but they have been impacted through furlough and redundancy. So a lot of them work in the gig economy and the hospitality sector. So they may be a little bit more price conscious than they were pre-COVID. Before that, they were quite happy to pay for experiences as part of their social life. So they would go to Friday late events where there's sort of music and food and drink on offer, and they were quite happy to pay for that. But post-COVID, there may be more reluctance depending on how they've been impacted. They're also a really key audience for digital engagement, but specifically for more experimental, born digital, participatory type activities, rather than things that are being delivered online that were previously delivered in person. And they're also more likely to be content creators online as well. So they like things that they can actually contribute to the activity. Dormitory dependables, they're regular but not frequent visitors. Pre-COVID, they got out and about quite a lot. They haven't been doing quite so much. They are an older group, and so they have been at risk health-wise, but they're one of the groups which is showing readiness to return. So they will be looking for opportunities to get out and about, particularly nearer home. They are a core audience for museums and heritage. So you are likely, if you have them in your catchment area, to see them returning quite soon. Trips and treats are one of the key family groups, and again, a core audience for museums. Arts and culture isn't sort of important to them in and of itself, but they enjoy a museum visit as part of a wider day out. And they are again looking for those opportunities for shared family experiences. Getting out with their friends and family is a really key part of their kind of leisure time and what they like to do. So museums that are reopening and offering the opportunity to socialize, they will be looking for those sorts of opportunities. And in your marketing and messaging for this group, it's important to try and include what else there is in your area for them to do, so they can plan a whole day out, including your site as part of that. Home and heritage are again one of the older segments. They do account for a large proportion of the sort of coach trip visitor market, which isn't picking up very quickly at the moment. They're still quite hesitant to return to that sort of visiting. So again, it may be a while before you see them coming back, unless you have them in your local catchment area, in which case they're likely to be quite a core audience for you. high proportion of National Trust and Heritage, English Heritage membership in this group. Up our street, as I say, they tend to be in the sort of outlying neighbourhoods of towns and smaller cities. They're more likely to be spending time at home, so they weren't highly engaged pre-COVID, and they face even more barriers following COVID. They were already at high risk economically, and they have seen a severe hit through redundancy. And also they are, again, you know, a number of them are at high risk health-wise. Many of them are older, 50 plus, and also have some health and mobility issues as well. So around almost half of them are living with a long-term health condition. So they already face significant barriers to getting out and about, and COVID has just exacerbated that, really. So outdoor opportunities particularly are the sort of thing that this group is looking for, and also making sure that any COVID safety measures that you have in place are really clearly communicated to help them have the confidence to engage with you. And Facebook families, again, lower engaged group, living on in sort of small towns. Again, arts engagement, not a priority for this group, but they do enjoy free family drop-in activities, something that's a sort of guaranteed fun day out for the family. They are generally younger, so then they haven't seen themselves as being at high risk health-wise, but the economic impacts have been quite severe for this group. They were already quite cash strapped, and then having children at home for prolonged periods of time has been a huge burden to them financially, and they're also very vulnerable to the impacts of recession and redundancy as well, because many of them already living in areas of high unemployment. So again, they do face quite significant barriers to engagement. So, you know, things that are low risk, no cost, and have a sort of familiar, family-friendly offer are likely to be encouraging for them to engage with you. So that was a very quick romp through some of the segments which are most significant for the Southeast region. I would encourage you to dig into the pen portraits online to build a deeper understanding of who those different groups are. And at the end of this slide set, there's a whole list of sources and resources which will give you information about each of the segments, but also about the impacts of the COVID pandemic from a segment point of view, but also from different sort of demographic groups as well. So it's definitely worth digging into those as part of your sort of informed strategic planning. And thinking about how you can put segmentation into practice in terms of that informed planning. It's, you know, segmentation can be really useful to help you align the your target audiences with what you want to achieve as an organization. So one of the things we looked at in the first session was how many organizations are in a position of balancing what may be seen as competing strategic priorities in terms of financial obligations, curatorial or cultural ambitions, and social responsibility priorities as well, reaching out to underserved communities, for example. But by putting audiences at the heart of all of those different types of activity and using segmentation to help you understand which types of audience are going to help you achieve your ambitions in each of those strategic areas, can really help bring all of those things together. So your audience development planning should be part of your overall strategy, including your business planning and things like that. It helps you to build a shared understanding and a shared language across your organisation, but also externally, about the people that you want to engage with and why they're important to you, and also why they will be drawn to your offer, what it is that you can offer them that's going to help build a meaningful relationship. And you can also use tools like the Ansoff matrix, which we looked at in the last session, to understand, what you're going to do for these different groups of people, whether they're people that you already engage with and you want more of them, or whether you want them to do different things with you, or whether they are new audiences to you and you're going to use different marketing strategies or different programming ideas to engage with them. So overall, it just helps you to be more targeted in everything that you do. I'm aware that we're just running slightly over time, so I'll just whiz very quickly through the next few slides. That's just a reminder that the next session in this series is next Thursday, and it will be about collecting audience data, which will help you build the understanding of those segments, for example, if you don't already collect that information. And then all those links that I talked about to further information. All of the things that I've talked about today are explored in more detail through these different links. And there's some COVID information there as well. Phew. So there we go. Sorry to have overrun slightly on that, but I hope it has been useful for you.